الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Before I begin the topic and continue the topic I've been speaking about, how the organizers asked me to speak briefly about some of the activities that I'm involved with, just to introduce the community to it. Typically, many of the scholars out of or out of the Hausa, they typically they'll fulfill some sort of a role in the community as an imam of a masjid, and then do community activities. I chose a little bit different route, something more kind of in line with the seminaries and research. So basically all of my work is research related. I work for two nonprofit organizations. One is called the Islamic Text Institute, which is an organization I was a part of founding when I left Qom. And it's an effort by myself and some of my teachers in Qom, and then a whole team of kind of a support network here in America, to bring Islamic primary sources to our community. Right, so we have primary sources that are books of hadith, the Quran itself, books of du'as, and they're completely entirely in Arabic. We do have some translation efforts that have happened. The thing we're trying to do is to write commentary on these texts that's relevant for us here in the West, and then translate those texts at a very high level, meaning with a lot of a high level of quality, and put those in the hands of the Shia here. So we have a couple of publications we've already accomplished, alhamdulillah. One is a commentary on Duan Nudba that I think you all might be familiar with. It was published several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. More recently, this past year, we published the first book of Kitab al-Kafi, which is our first and one of our most important books of hadith, with a hadith from the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. So the first volume is this. It's the book of intellect and foolishness, and I've shared some hadith with you here in the lectures as well. The second book is on its way out. It's at press right now, and inshallah within the next month or two it should be available. And that's the book of knowledge and its virtue. And like that, we're going to continue inshallah. There are 8 books in Usul al-Kafi, and so they'll be published individually like that. And then if Allah gives us enough of a life, then we'll continue. There are 35 books in all in Kitab al-Kafi. So inshallah, the wish is that we can complete the whole thing, but if we can at least do Usul al-Kafi, that would be great in our lifetime. The other kind of organization I'm working with is the Imam Mahdi Association. They've commissioned a couple of books for me to write, and I wrote and published a textbook on Tajweed several years ago. So that's there. And then just recently, I actually finished a book on the prophets. So it's a narration. It's the story of all of the prophets that are mentioned in the Quran, taking all of the ahadith that we have, all of the verses of the Quran we have, piecing it all together into a narrative written for an adult audience. It's not a children's book, it's for an adult audience. It reads like a novel, with footnotes to kind of explain things that are happening behind the scenes, and kind of to show the process that went into actually writing the story. And so inshallah that's just finished. The editing is now done, so it's close to being published as well. That's the kind of activity I'm involved with, just for your information. I think Brother Abbas afterwards will have Al-Kafi and Al-Nudba available outside if you'd like to purchase them, they're available as well. Recite salawat, please.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
All right, so as a continuation of our topic, I've been speaking each night about these paradigms that we encounter on a daily basis, and I've offered some criticism of them, and sometimes some replacements or some ways of reforming our way of thinking about things. Today's paradigm it's a challenging one, and it's one that I alluded to earlier, and this is the paradigm that again, it's uncomfortable, but we have to discuss it, right? So I'm going to give you all the disclaimers and stuff in the beginning. But it's this paradigm that being attracted to the same gender is something that's normal and okay. Right? And again, as uncomfortable as it is to speak about or listen to or anything, hopefully you'll agree that this is something that's really important. Right? Think of the mission of one of the missions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam as also practically with his own life and with everything he had this effort to break these paradigms that had become normalized for the people of his time. They now thought that the Khalifa of the Muslims, the replacement, the standard bearer of Islam, could be someone like Yazid. Their model of what it meant to be the Khalifa of the Muslims had degenerated to the level where someone who was exactly the opposite of the Prophet could now be the successor of the Prophet. And exactly because that paradigm had been so shifted from where it should have been, Imam Hussein took these extreme measures of going out as he did and going to the extent of giving his own life and the life of his family and the life of his companions for the sake of jarring the Muslim nation to reform these paradigms and show them that this is not correct, this is not the Khalifa of the Muslims, and the Khalifa should be someone like me with my qualities, my knowledge, my background. This is the model that you want. Right? So in that spirit, this paradigm shifting and paradigm breaking is a very relevant topic for us as well. Now, is this topic of kind of addressing the normalization of same-sex marriage, is that something appropriate for this kind of a session? Again, I argue, like I did earlier, that yes, absolutely it is. This is something, if you think that it's too sensitive for children to listen to, or for us to speak about in the masjid, think again. Right? If we think we're somehow safe from it, the only way you can really remain safe from it is if you completely cut yourself off from TV, from movies, from the internet, from newspapers, from the radio, from basically every single thing that you can think of, any outlet you have to the outside world, because it's a tidal wave that's now flooding over us, whether we like it or not. Right? So we can either passively sit by as it happens to us and then pick up the remains afterwards, or we can set up our defenses now, think about it constructively, think about it carefully, prepare ourselves, prepare our children, and then when it hits, then they'll be ready for it. Okay. So it's there all around us. Even the Quran thinks it's appropriate for us. So unless you're ready to censor out the Quran when your kids read it, and say, don't read the verses on Prophet Lut alayhi salam. Right, that's not appropriate for children as an audience, right? Unless you're prepared to censor out the Quran, then the Quran also discusses this, and it presents this moral vice, and in graphic detail, I might add, and the consequences of what Allah did to those people, right? So it's there in front of us. Allah has been very forward-thinking and proactive by presenting this to us much long before we face the current problems we now have, but now we're in the thick of it, and we need to be prepared so that we can counter this paradigm. Why is this paradigm something that's so important? This paradigm of normalization of same-sex relations and marriages. One issue is that we, it's similar to the same psychology I think happens as what we discussed when we talked about diversity of religions. When we talked about how religion is not something subjective, it's rather an objective reality, one of the things we talked about was that when we deal with diversity of religions, one of the tendencies, one of the responses we sometimes have is we desensitize ourselves to the ugliness of false religion. Right? So many times we've adopted this kind of attitude where even if we were to, for instance, walk into a Hindu temple, right, and see their idols and see how they're worshiping their idols. I just take them as an example, a Buddhist temple or any other place where, for instance, idolatry, which we know we have a very solid precedent from Ibrahim alayhi salam, his iconoclasty, if that's the noun, right, breaking the idols. Our Prophet also breaking the idols. We have a very strong precedent for how our attitude towards idols should be. But now we've become so desensitized that I would guess that we'd be able to walk into a Hindu temple, watch them in their services, and kind of indifferently just observe it casually. And there's something wrong with that. right? The Quran talks about idol worship. It says that idol worship is something so earth-shaking, there's something so terribly wrong with it that the skies themselves they'll just about rip asunder just because of the abomination of idol worship. Right? So that should be our response. We should be averse to evil. We should be averse to false ideas in general, especially false religions and false beliefs. Now, that's not to say that we have to show our enmity, for instance, go and be violent and break their idols down, or we have to speak harshly. We spoke about that. In our hearts, in our minds, we should know the falseness of false ideas and have that disgust for anything that's against God. That doesn't mean necessarily that in our actions, in the way we present ourselves, the way we interact with people, that it has to be ugly. Just the opposite. If our goal is to effectively speak out against these things and effectively change people, then as we talked about yesterday, we need to be soft and kind and compassionate and merciful to help them to get there. So it is a balancing act between our internal beliefs and feelings and our external diplomacy and the way we're going to interact with people. Okay. But that internal part is what we need to work on here. Here we don't need to sugarcoat anything because we're amongst ourselves. We're all thinking the same. We have the same goals in mind, right? So the same thinking goes for this. When we are constantly being bombarded by an environment and by policies and by laws and by propaganda that is aimed at desensitizing us to something like same-sex marriage, it can have an effect on us if we're not careful. Where we also start to think that it's something normal. We lose our sensitivity to it. In my lifetime, I felt this. Right? And I'm sure you have also observed this. If you think back 20 years ago to just do a scan of the TV shows you might have watched or the movies you might have watched, and it was hard. There's hardly any mention of this kind of stuff, and if there was, it was a very sensitive thing. And the predominant reaction of people, right, not just religious people, not just Muslim people, but other people as well, was one of aversion. This is something that's unspeakable. It's an abomination. It's wrong, and all this stuff. That was the general sensitivity of people. And now look where we've come to, where speaking out against it or saying that it's wrong is now the anomaly. That's the voice that's now being suppressed and censored. That's not appropriate to say in public. And it's the norm to say that it's fine and it's good and it's normal and all. It's a viable option for any person and that sort of thing, right? So that's the importance of it. We need to resensitize ourselves. We've been desensitized by all of this other stuff. We need to resensitize ourselves to the ugliness of the act, right? So that we put it in its own place. One of the reasons why that is important, why it's important to resensitize ourselves to this, is to make sure that our people, especially younger people, don't start to buy into this idea that this is also an option, a viable option. And this is a real threat and a real danger for us. You might be aware, there are gay Muslim groups. There are bona fide organizations, even I've heard mosques that are catering to people who claim to be homosexual and are Muslim at the same time, and they're trying to find ways to justify their lifestyle or choices through Islamic texts and somehow be faithful to Islam and at the same time practice this sort of activity. Right? So this is a real thing that we have to deal with, and if our kids are not sensitized to it, then they'll buy into this and think, well, this is an option. Heterosexual relations are an option, and these same-sex relations are also an option. And if you feel one way, you go with the feeling, and that sort of a thing. And everything's normal. It's all whatever you feel, whatever you want, whatever you like, it goes. Okay, so that's why I think it's something so important, and we shouldn't get over the uncomfortableness of the whole issue and just be very serious about the discussion and have it. like a bitter medicine. Swallow it, deal with it, and move on. Okay, recite the salawat, please. It's also important to speak about this as Muslims because we have, as Muslims, especially as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, we have something very valuable to offer to the whole discussion. That's almost never put out there. It's almost never shared. We don't really have a voice, or we haven't made a voice for ourselves to be able to express these things that we have to offer. And one of the things that we should be careful of, we have people on one side who are pro, for instance, same-sex marriage and these kinds of things. That's the majority, that's the predominant force in our society. We also do have a voice of these conservative, kind of fundamentalist Christians who are opposed to that. Right? We should not make the mistake of joining forces with these fundamentalist Christians in their attack on the I don't know what to call it, the gay lobby, for instance. Let's just call that to make it easy to refer to it. Right? Why? Because many of the arguments that these people use, the Christian fundamentalists use against same-sex marriage to show that it's something wrong, are arguments that are trivial and baseless. Right? We talked about an end justifying a means. We said that doesn't work. Right? That's the kind of paradigm that the Christian fundamentalists often use to try to justify. They have the end of prohibiting same-sex marriage. Right? They use that end, which is a correct end, to justify false arguments. They use false arguments to try to build up their case, and because the false arguments and the weak arguments are weak, once the arguments are shot down, your claim itself falls down as well. Right. Let me make it a little more clear with examples. So one of the things that they say, for instance, for why same-sex marriage is wrong, is that the whole purpose of marriage is procreation, having children. And because a same-sex couple cannot have children, therefore it goes against the whole spirit of marriage. Marriage wasn't designed for this. Right? If that's your argument, then what about, then you should have laws, and these are not my counter arguments. You hear these from the gay lobby as well. If that's your argument, that the spirit of marriage, the purpose of marriage is procreation, then you should bar people who are sterile from getting married. If you have a man or a woman who can't have children, since the whole purpose of marriage is having children, they should not be allowed to be married because they aren't going to have children. When that's absolutely not the case. Nobody says that people who are sterile don't have the right to get married. Of course they can get married. Or you should say old people, women who are past menopause and elderly people, they should not be able to get remarried or married, right? Because they're not going to have children either. She's too old to have children. Therefore it should not be allowed. When absolutely, we all agree that they're allowed to get married. There's no problem with elderly people getting married. Right? So if you have that kind of an argument that can be shot down, and that's how you're building your case, that because of this and because of this and because of this, that's why same-sex marriage is not allowed, then all someone has to do is come shoot down your three ideas, and the conclusion also falls with it, dies with it. All right, another argument they have is, for instance, that same-sex couples can't raise children in a healthy way. Right? But then all you need is one example of a child who's been raised in a good way by a lesbian or a gay couple, and that argument's also shot out of the water. And recently there was a young man who was just from an American perspective very really well-rounded, well-educated, community service, a Boy Scout, and just everything you could think of as like a well-rounded person, and he was raised by two mothers. And it was a big deal. He was publicized. He wrote a book about I think it's called My Two Mothers, I think was the name of his book. And he was really played up because this was a model person, a model citizen who was raised by these kinds of people. All right, so my argument is, let us not align ourselves with people just because we seem to be saying about the same thing, because they don't have what we have. They're offering arguments, and they have a whole idea that the reason why same-sex marriage is not allowed is because of these different reasons. Whereas we have a very, very rich and complex system of law. And let me just take a small digression to explain a little bit about our system of law, to show you why this kind of reasoning that I just mentioned doesn't hold water from an Islamic perspective. We, especially as Shia, we are known as people who believe that the laws of Allah are purposeful. Right? When Allah determines that something is wajib on us or something is haram for us, it's not an arbitrary ruling. He doesn't just want to see. He had a choice of making pork haram or beef haram or mutton haram, and he just randomly chose that. I'll just make pork haram just for the heck of it. Right? That's not the way the law works. He's all wise, all knowing, and the law is there the law is there to serve our best interest. And so if you make something haram, then it's because there's some harm in that thing for us, and the harm outweighs the good. And likewise, if you make something wajib for us, there's some great benefit in doing it, which outweighs any possible harm that could also ensue. Right? That's an important belief of ours to know, that our rules, our laws, and the Sharia are based on real harm and benefit, that Allah knows better than we do. That said, the harm and benefit that's there in any given law is not necessarily obvious. The only harm that exists is not material and physical harm. We are not solely material and physical beings. We have a soul too. And there might be harm in something that doesn't have anything to do with our physical body. The harm might be something spiritual, which can't be empirically measured. It can't be examined in the lab. And the only way we can understand that harm is by Allah telling us. As our designer and creator, He knows how we function and how we work and what's going to mess up things and things like that. So He, with His infinite knowledge, He comes and says, for instance, eating pork is haram. Now sometimes we can make guesses. Sometimes we do know the absolute cause, because He Himself has told us. For instance, with wine and intoxicants, right? We know that the reason for them being haram is because of its intoxicating quality. Okay, so that's clear only because He's told us that that's the reason. Whereas with pork, for instance, just as an example, pork, right? We can guess there are certain harms. We can look at some certain health harms that are there in eating pork. Maybe there's certain parasites that are there in pork that are harmful. There are maybe certain things like that. But that's not necessarily the reason and the cause for Allah saying that it's haram. And we shouldn't make that mistake of oversimplifying things and trying to justify and show people how rational Islam is, and say the reason why pork is haram is because of this particular disease or this particular health consequence of eating pork. Because just like they had those frivolous arguments against same-sex marriage, this also becomes a frivolous argument, an arbitrary argument. What if somebody's able to come and solve those problems? Right? If we claim that it's parasites, a certain trichinosis or whatever, a parasite that's in pork, and that's why it's haram, well, now I'm sure maybe there's a way to cure that. If not now, maybe in the future there will be a way to eradicate that particular parasite and make sure that a particular piece of pork doesn't have that parasite. Does the law change? Does it become halal all of a sudden? Maybe it's because the pigs are really dirty. They eat dirty food and they're all of this stuff. So what if we make raise a pig in a very clean environment? Only feed it good wholesome food. We make sure its environment is clean. Does it become halal all of a sudden? No, it doesn't. But if our arguments are this and we present it like this, then at the end we're left kind of in a quandary, because all of a sudden we were trying to show that Islam is so rational, but then as soon as we were able to eradicate those reasons why we were claiming pig is haram, we eradicate those things and we still have to say no, it's still haram. And we become totally irrational, because we put all of our eggs in this false basket that had tons of holes in it, and now the eggs are all gone. Right? So what we should understand is that if something is haram, for instance, there is definitely some real reason why that's the case. And it is truly to our detriment to partake in that thing. And the only reason we know that is because Allah has told us through either through the Quran or through the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. What exactly those harms are, sometimes they give us hints, sometimes they tell us explicitly. In this case, they haven't. So we can guess, we can say, well, some of the reasons could be some of these things, but we don't know the entire reason why pork is haram. But we do know there's some reason. There could be some spiritual harm in it. And in fact, we do have hints of that as well in the hadith. That they say, for instance, one of the spiritual or psychological harms of eating pork is that it removes this quality of ghaira from a person. Ghaira is a sense of honor that a person is supposed to have. A good sense of honor, where, for instance, it's especially a good trait for men to have, this sense that, for instance, if someone looks at your wife the wrong way, that sense of anger that would come up in you, and say, how dare you even look at her the wrong way. That's a good quality that's been planted in us, that we're supposed to have, right? And it's a virtue, but we're told that if someone eats pork, that quality is diminished. They won't be so upset. They'll say, oh, no problem, go ahead and look if you want. Right? That quality is diminished. Now, it's not something you can necessarily measure and do psychological analyses of people who eat pork and don't eat pork and see does it play out or not. It's not something we can measure like that. So there's something behind the scenes that we don't really understand, but we're told through revelation that this is the case, and that's why, for instance, pork has been made haram. Okay, so the same thing goes for these same-sex relationships. There are we can make guesses the way these people, Christians, are making guesses at some of the possible harms, but we shouldn't make the mistake of saying this is why God has made it unlawful. Right? Because of the same problem. Because as soon as somebody can show that these things are not problems anymore, or we can control for these problems, then we shouldn't be able to insist that it's still unlawful, even though you've solved all these problems. And if we do, then we become the irrational people. So from the beginning, understand, you draw on our rich legal tradition as Shi'i Muslims, with this whole theory of the actual and real basis for law, and present our argument in a very rigorous way that can't then be shot down in such an easy manner. So we should be honest to say that we don't know exactly why this is haram. Why these relationships are complete forbidden. We don't know the exact reason and all the reasons of that. Right? We do have some idea of some of the harms that ensue, but we don't have the whole idea. But what we do know, without a doubt, is that the relationship is haram. That any sort of homosexual relationship is haram, and there's no doubt about that. And we know that without a doubt because of the teachings of the Quran, which are explicit, or because of the teachings of the Hadith, which are also explicit. Okay, so that's something we can add to the fray. Another perspective that is much stronger, much more intellectually rigorous than what other people are offering. And if we put ourselves with them, then we'll encounter this danger that our arguments will also feel like we're scrambling for reasons and for justification for a law that to everyone else seems to be very arbitrary. Okay. Recite with salawat, please. Okay, let me give you a couple of key points. Let's keep that as a bottom line. We know for a fact that the relationships themselves are haram. So we're not even going to discuss that. The whole idea here is the paradigm of this idea that such a relationship is normal. Right? Somebody who believes that it's normal, they may not themselves partake in it. They might themselves have a normal heterosexual relationship, and they think that's the best way, and but they feel that it's normal at least for somebody to choose the other way. That's the paradigm that we want to make sure that we're not giving into and we're not accepting. Right. One important thing to understand from our Islamic perspective is that there is a difference between homosexuality and homosexual acts. Right? And don't worry, I'm not going to speak explicitly at all, but this is a really important distinction, because one of the things that the gay lobby has been trying to do and is doing a very good job of is to identify, they use this term sexual orientation, right? To identify sexual orientation as part of a person's being. that to make the claim that people are created in this way or in that way. Right? And so some people they use the term they're created and then they are heterosexual, that's part of their identity and who they are, and some people are homosexual, that's who they are, that's how they're created, that's who they are, that's part of their identity. Once you make it like that, it's just like race and color and all these other things. I didn't have a choice. This is how God made me. I was created in this way. I don't have a choice. If you ask me to deny myself this particular thing, then it's like you're telling me, don't be brown anymore. You should be white. Right? It's as impossible then. Once you set up that kind of a paradigm, and Islam, from an Islamic perspective, we should resist that effort of theirs to change the way we think of things, to think that there are certain people who are by nature heterosexual and people are by nature homosexual. That's not the case. Right? Rather, there are certain acts, and those acts of a homosexual, those acts are haram. If a person has certain inclinations and certain wants in himself, he's not accountable for those. It's only when it comes into the realm of action and they act on those desires, that act then becomes something that's haram. Right? That's the Islamic perspective. The act itself is a haram act. We don't identify people as either this or like that, but there's some sort of orientation. We're all oriented the way, we're all created the same way. Right? Let me tweak that a little bit too. This is another thing that we can add to the thing from our rich tradition, to understand that gender is. This is going to sound very weird, but bear with me. That gender is a continuum between completely male and completely female. I'm not saying anything kind of off the wall or something totally new, but it might be something that you haven't heard before, or thought about before. What I mean is that we have people, and we have this in our experience, I'm sure you've encountered people who are very masculine, but then you have some men who are maybe more effeminate. Sometimes their voices are a certain way, sometimes just the way they carry themselves is a certain way, maybe their build is not quite as rugged as you would expect, maybe they have less hair, facial hair and stuff like that. Same on the women's side. You have women who are completely feminine, but then you might have some, like we call them tomboys, for instance, right? More tomboyish, more stronger. Maybe they have a gruffer voice. And these kinds of things. They're still women, but they have certain masculine qualities. And so you can think of gender as this continuum between totally male and then men who are more effeminate, totally female, women who are more masculine. And then we do also have this reality of people who are hermaphrodites, who have been born with both organs. Right? And that is a reality, and our fiqh it deals with this problem. Right? It's not something that we're somehow in denial of, we didn't understand, and Islamic law has no idea how to deal with this. Right? The standard textbook in the Hawza for studying Islamic law, Sharh al-Lum'ah, deals with this. Every issue that comes up about men and women, then it has one special ruling for the khuntha, the hermaphrodite, who's in the middle, and what they're supposed to do. Right? So in terms of creation and how we're made, we have this continuum of gender. That's not to say, the next step is not to say, so if you have a male who's a little bit more effeminate, then it's okay for him to, for instance, like other men. No, that's not the case. Islamic law comes in and still pushes us towards those extremes and those polar extremes. And this is something I think is really interesting, and hopefully you'll find it interesting as well, that it adds a layer of understanding to many of our Islamic laws which otherwise might seem arbitrary. Like, have you ever thought why men don't wear gold, aren't allowed to wear gold and silk? Why do men have to have beards, these kinds of things? And so one of the wisdoms behind this, wisdom, not the cause, but one of the wisdoms behind many of the laws that we have is to push all men towards that extreme of being men, masculine, and push women all to that extreme of being effeminate. Right? Even if they fall somewhere along in the middle, biologically, we still push them towards those ends. So let me give you some examples of these kinds of laws. One, like I mentioned, in terms of our dress and appearance, Islam puts a lot of emphasis on men looking like men and women looking like women. And we're not allowed to blur those lines. So it's actually haram for men to wear anything that is characteristically for women in your particular culture. and vice versa. For women to wear something that's characteristically for men in a particular culture, it's haram for them to do that. So as an example, you can argue about the example, but as an example, for instance, a tie, right? If a tie in a particular culture is something that men wear, then for a woman to wear a tie would be haram. Right? Or if a particular color, say, again, this is just an example, say for instance certain colors, pink or something like that, purple, are colors that are strictly for women in a particular culture, then in that culture for men to wear that color would be haram. Right? And that's going to change from culture to culture, so don't get too excited about the examples themselves. Right? Maybe there are other examples you can think of that are relevant to our circumstances here. The gold and silk I mentioned, right? So gold and silk are haram for men to wear. Pure silk or any sort of gold is haram for men to wear, but it's permissible for women. Right? Again, one of those ways of separating it, gold and silk are considered effeminate types of things, and they're only for women to wear, and if men wear it, it's haram. The beard, right? It's haram for a man to shave his beard. Right? And one of the wisdoms behind that is, again, to accentuate the difference between men and women. Clearly, women don't have that beard, and men do, and it's something that differentiates them and makes them look more masculine by having this facial hair. Right? Think of some other examples. Like for instance, we have so many laws that are geared towards controlling our desires, our attractions. We talked about this that first lecture about the idea, yes, attraction happens once all the ingredients are there, but we can stop the ingredients from ever mixing, right? And so think about those same things again. We have restrictions against, for instance, seeing other people in a decent state, even the same sex. Right? So for instance, you go to a locker room, and this is something the kids should also know if you don't know this already, right? When you go to your locker room at school, if you have to change your clothes, right, you're not allowed to expose yourself to others, and you can't see other people either. Right? In American culture, if you're the same gender, then it's totally normal. And they actually think it's weird if you don't. Right? But we should know that it's haram to expose yourself, your private parts, to expose yourself even to other men or even to other women, right? And it's haram for you to look even at other men or even at other women, right? So that's another one of those things where even if somebody had the tendency, say they were closer to the middle point on that gender continuum, right? If they were in a society that normalized that kind of interaction in the locker room, then they would easily fall into temptation there, right? Whereas Islam is saying, no, absolutely not. You're not allowed, even other men, even other women of the same gender, you're not allowed to even look at them, in a decent state. So even if, from a natural perspective, you might have had a tendency, Islam comes in and gives us guidance to show us how to prevent that attraction from ever taking place. So you never act on the tendency. You never have any reason to act on the tendency because you've protected yourself. And you've distanced yourself in the correct way. Right? There's so many other rules like this that are there in our Islamic law that does the same thing. I have a whole list of them. I won't go through them in detail, but you get the gist of it. Right? So that's a beautiful thing as well, to understand that Islam itself, because there's this whole discussion amongst people who are debating this thing about nature versus nurture. Right? Is something like homosexuality, according to the term that they use, is it something that's naturally created in that person? Or is it a matter of their environment, how they were raised? Maybe they were abused, maybe they had certain issues in their life, and that's why they've resorted to these kinds of deviant practices. Right? So there's a debate, is it one or the other, or is there some mix of the two? And so Islam addresses these things. It tells us that there is a part of nature at play, and there's also a part of nurture. Right? A person from a natural perspective might be closer to the middle line on that continuum, right? So naturally he might have certain inclinations. But the nurture comes in as well. If he's in a healthy environment, if he's raised correctly, if she's taught the do's and don'ts, and she understands, and they live a life that's Islamic, then they'll be able to, they won't have those temptations, and they'll be empowered with the ability to resist those temptations. They'll know the ideals, and they won't give in to that nature. Right? So it addresses that balance between nurture and nature, and tells us how to deal with it, even if it's something not natural. Because otherwise, people who say it's all natural, they say, well, that's the way God made us. That's the way I was made. So who are we to say that I shouldn't act on something that's natural? Right? But we have so many tendencies, we have so many desires for so many different things. We're not allowed to just justify our actions in anything and saying, well, I desired it, so I went for it, I took it, without any kind of limitation on myself. Right? You have a sweet tooth and you eat chocolate with a bad din. Right? You can't just indulge yourself and justify and say, well, I ate as much as I wanted because I desired it. Right? There are health consequences, there are appearance consequences to making a choice like that. And we limit ourselves, even though we naturally might desire it, but we limit ourselves based on other considerations. So the same thing applies here as well, that it might be that people have inclinations towards certain kinds of things, but they still have the power, they have the willpower, and they have the guidance from Islam, and we have a society that's designed based on Islamic standards. All of those things come together to help a person to follow a particular path and not give in to these desires, even if they are natural. Recite a salawat, please. One of the things we should keep in mind when we're dealing with this whole issue is we should maintain perspective on this particular sinful act, which is these same-sex relations. Oftentimes what Muslims do, and I don't know if we get it from our Christian counterparts or where it's come from, but we tend to write off somebody who for instance, claims to be a homosexual, or even engages in these acts, and we'll banish that person and say that person's, he's hellbound, he's condemned to hell, or if he was a Muslim, he's no longer Muslim. We'll banish this person, write the person off because of this particular sin that he's committed. Right? That's a mistake that we shouldn't make. We should keep. When I say maintain perspective, that doesn't mean that we should downplay the sin or downplay the badness of the act itself. But I'm saying keep perspective and realize that this is a sin like many other sins that people commit. If a person is a Muslim and she, for instance, embezzles funds at work, is she now a kafir? Do we say she's no longer a Muslim? She's still a Muslim. She's done a terrible thing, but she's still a Muslim. If a person commits, for instance, adultery and these kinds of things, do we banish the person and say the person is no longer fit to be in our company and we have to ostracize him from the community and these kinds of things? It's a sin. It's a terrible sin. It's a major sin. But it doesn't mean that the person has left the fold of Islam or that the person's going to hell. Right? Even we have the differentiation. Even in Islamic law, we differentiate between someone who's married and someone who's not married. And Islamic law is more lenient in the punishment it gives for someone who's not married who engages in indecent acts than someone who is married, because the one who's married had a halal option and he didn't take it. Whereas someone who's not married, they didn't have the halal option, and so Islamic law even allows for a less severe punishment for that man or that woman who engages as a single person. So when that's the case, we see that there is that room for leniency. Right? We don't know the same idea about judgment. We can say the act is wrong, absolutely. But to pass judgment on the person and say the person is going to hell for that act, that's not our prerogative, that's not in our jurisdiction. The same thing that we talked about with religion, we can say, and we should say clearly that this is true and those religions are false, but it doesn't justify us saying, you as a Christian are going to hell, or you as a Sunni are going to hell. It doesn't justify that. We can say your belief is wrong, and here are the reasons why your belief is wrong. But it's possible the person could fix himself, repent, come over to the right path. It could happen that he's justified. He has a legitimate excuse before Allah. like I mentioned before, he didn't know, he didn't have access, there are too many barriers in his life and stuff like that, and for whatever reason, Allah justifies his following a false religion because that was the best he could do. Right, so the judgment is really complicated, and thankfully it's not our job. That's Allah's job. It's a very complicated thing that only He's qualified to do, because only He has that infinite knowledge of all those circumstances that go into that person's committing of that sin. Okay. So we should maintain that perspective, and the same way that we are sometimes, not so hard on ourselves. If I'm the one who perpetrates the sin, then I have all the justification at my hand. I know that I had the temptation, I had this, I had this need, and whatever else, and I'll justify it for myself and somehow make it seem not so bad for myself. But when it comes to someone else, as soon as they commit a sin, sometimes we're ready to execute them, right? Without even understanding the perspective. So it's one thing, again, we're not trying to blur the line and say somehow the sin itself is okay. No, the act is a sin and it's wrong, right? But we shouldn't judge the person and say, for instance, the person is going to hell, or banish the person, or think this person cannot no longer be Muslim. You can be a Muslim and engage in these haram acts, just like you can be a Muslim and you can drink, for instance. You can be a Muslim and you can engage in other haram things. You're not a good Muslim, you're a sinful Muslim who's doing things that are against Allah's law, and you'll have to face the consequences for that. But we shouldn't be so quick to write people off. Right? That's not something we're allowed to do, to somehow excommunicate people from the Muslim community and say they're no longer Muslim. The only instance I can think of where we're allowed to excommunicate people, again, it's not really relevant here, being an Islamic government, but in the Quran it talks about people who are, I guess maybe it would apply to someone like a terrorist. Somebody who terrorizes people, scares people, frightens people by, for instance, wielding a weapon. Or someone to wield a weapon in public and everyone's scared for their life. That kind of a person, there are very severe punishments that are mentioned in the Quran. I believe there are 3 options. My memory is foggy, but one of them is to banish the person. One of them is to execute the person in a very horrific way. And one is to banish them, and there's one third one I can't remember. But that's the one instance where we're allowed to excommunicate people from Muslim society because they're such a danger and a threat to society. But these other sins, they're not like that. One last idea I want to throw out there is another mistake that we sometimes make. We are living in a secular society. Sometimes what I feel like the fundamentalist Christians do with issues like this, they're trying to inject a biblical understanding of things into a secular law. By definition, by agreement of all of our citizens, our law is secular. Religion has no role to play. Right? We shouldn't make that same mistake of, for instance, like our response to this normalization of same-sex marriage should not be, but the Sharia says such and such, the Quran says such and such. Because we're living in a secular society, that argument is a baseless argument in society. If we're going to argue this point, if we're going to, try to, have our voice heard, then we have to do it on secular terms, on democratic terms. So if, for instance, we wanted to make a point and say that we're not okay with same-sex marriage in our state, for instance, or in our city, or whatever it is, then the way to do it is not to argue religion. Because we're in a secular society, we'd have to do it in democratic ways. Convince people, get people out to vote for, a particular way on a referendum, for instance. To lobby your political leaders and these kinds of things. Like, it has to happen through a democratic process if we're going to have any voice. If we cross the boundaries and in a secular society start arguing religion, then we do a disservice to ourselves, and we're arguing in ways that have no foundation, because anyone else who isn't a Muslim, they're going to completely ignore our arguments. It's a wasted effort. But we can take the wisdom that we have from Islam, convince Muslims of that, maybe even convince other people who are not Muslim of the wisdom of particular ideas, and then try to convince them and gain momentum, political momentum, to press society in a particular way. That's the way to do it. If you wanted to do anything like that, right? But And just as many other things, other haram things have become normalized in our society, and it's not the end of the world. It's terrible. Think of like alcohol, for instance, how normal alcohol is. Right? How normal adultery and fornication are, for instance. Right? Other haram things and sinful things are also normalized in society. Right? This same-sex marriage is also another one we can add to the list, and probably within maybe our lifetime, definitely within maybe the next couple of years, it's going to be completely normalized. It's not necessarily something that we can change because of the secular society that we live in, but it is something that we can immunize ourselves against. So we, ourselves, and the people we have influence over, that we are not somehow affected by that normalization. We also start to think that it's okay to do it. It's okay to partake in these things. Everyone's doing it, so we can also participate. Right? That's my point in bringing this up and trying to shed some light on it. Recite salawat, please. Okay, questions?
Doesn't shirk take you outside of Islam?
Yes. So yeah, there's certain sins in terms of belief where you're renouncing the fundamental beliefs of Islam. That of course is completely contradictory to Islam. So that does take you out. But I'm talking about these other practical sins. Yeah. Rizwan.
Oh, yeah, you raised that first.
Okay. Go ahead, brother.
What's the punishment for that?
For homosexual acts?
No, for leaving Islam, like you said, shirk.
In our society, nothing. Again, because it's a secular society, those punishments, it's not really, it's a moot point, meaning it's a point that doesn't even need to be discussed currently because we don't have an Islamic government.
But according to Sharia, what would it be?
So it depends on the circumstances, but if the person is born into Islam and then renounces Islam and becomes murtad, then there's a death penalty. And if the person was a convert into Islam and then chose to leave, then there is still a death penalty, but he's given more leeway, where he's allowed to, if he or she repents and recants whatever they've said or done, then they're given, they're released. That's the textbook kind of application of the law. Practically how it would take place. That's in a mujtahid's kind of jurisdiction to determine exactly how does it play out and how it's going to be applied and stuff like that. Because it's irrelevant to our society. Even scholars don't usually pay much attention to it unless they're mujtahids. Then they'll deal with these issues from the sources.
Assalamu alaikum. I feel like when you watch TV or a lot of movies, you become desensitized to not only homosexual relationships, but also just PDA, too much PDA. And so you can get, desensitized to improper hijab, like girls dressing in very, revealing ways or guys. Is there a way to sensitize yourself to these even after, all these years living in America and so forth?
Yeah, she's asking, is there a way, how can we resensitize ourselves to these things that are that we know are obscene Islamically? I don't know any practical way besides educating ourselves and just becoming conscious of the ideals that Islam lays down. That itself, I think, is very effective. I felt that in my own life. Right? Because I wasn't very conscientious about religion for a part of my life, and so I was very desensitized to a lot of these things. And then once I became serious about the religion, then I was able to resensitize myself to these things. So now they do seem abhorrent. So I think I don't know exactly what's involved in that process, but what comes to mind is just educating ourselves, thinking about the abomination of it, seeing how the terrible consequences of things really are. Like the way they're presented in movies, for instance, they're glamorized. So alcohol is glamorized into something that looks very appealing, and only cool people do it. These kinds of things. But if you see people who are actually drunk, and you see how despicable they look, how wretched they are, like that reminds you of the reality of the thing. Right. The same thing with attraction between the genders and stuff. It's glorified on film, but when you see the consequences of children born out of wedlock and the psychological consequences that they have, the poverty, the disunity amongst the couples, and just all the terrible things that happen because of it, that's the reality of it. Like, don't be fooled by by what we see on film and TVs, on TV.
The fact that Nabi Lut's wife also got punishment even though she didn't partake in the sin, is that also an indication to us that we need to speak about it?
So he's asking about the wife of Lut alayhi salam. Her sin was facilitating the relationships, right? Not, I mean, as far as we don't have any evidence that she actually partook in it, but she was a facilitator, and she would actually, like we know when the angels came finally to destroy the people, she gave secret signals to her people to say, look, there's new raw meat here. Right? She had a special smoke signal that she lit up, and everyone came to attack these new guests because they saw them as young, handsome men, and that was her role in the thing. That's why she was destroyed.
So I'm wondering how the Muslims are justifying, the homosexuality or the homosexual acts.
Yeah.
I mean, other than the ayat we have do we have
So what I've seen from Al-Fatiha, that's the name of this group, is that they base their arguments on the Quran only. Like it doesn't look like they looked at hadith at all, and they've looked at the verses on Prophet Lut alayhi salam, and they've said that the reason they were punished was not because of the actual same-sex aspect of it. It was because of the other sins that they committed. It was public, for instance. That's what they were destroyed for. Or it was they were attacking people. They were forcing themselves on people. It wasn't consensual. It was a free for all. It wasn't a restricted like two-person relationship and stuff like that. So they say it was because of those aspects, and not particularly because of the same-sex part of it. That's the main argument I've understood from their website. Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. When we're in college, we have a lot of students that bring the argument. Can anyone bring an argument that has nothing to do with religion in favor of this? And I know you talked about democratic ways, but like even our professors and like national leaders, like they're all, in my eyes, at least jahil when it comes to this kind of subject. So like, how do we even bring about being against this, or like being in favor of a regular family, where kids gonna come from, things like that. Like how do we? What's the argument we use? Do you have like one or two?
I personally think that it's not fruitful to talk about this particular issue with someone who doesn't even understand or accept Islam yet. I think there are a lot. They need to start from. I put this in the same category, like I mentioned. It's just like any other sin, right? I'm not gonna jump in like right at the middle and say try to advocate for marriage and stuff like that, and against extramarital types of relationships for somebody who doesn't even accept Islam yet. They have more fundamental issues that they need to solve first. Teach them about Islam. Let's get Islam out there and make the whole package of Islamic guidance something that they're willing to buy into, and not try to deal with one particular issue. Because I don't think none of the arguments we can offer are going to be any better than the ones that fundamentalist Christians use. And if we offer those arguments, then like I said, they can be broken down easily. There's an organization, I think it's called NARTH. Is that? I think it's NARTH. NARTH. It's like National Alliance for the Reform and Therapy of Homosexuals. So I came across their website while I was researching this, and they are it's an organization of psychologists, these kinds of people who are trying to find they identify this as a sickness or a psychological disorder and these kinds of things, and they have whole programs for how to rectify. I don't know if they have anything that would help us, but it seems like they might. There's another website I saw actually today. I used to think it was pro-gay. It's called gaymuslims.org, but it's actually a very good website trying to bridge this by practicing Muslims who believe that it's haram, but they're trying to deal with it in a very thoughtful way. They don't just come out blazing with ready to burn people and say it's haram and it's abomination, this kind of stuff. They're trying to engage people, show them, like for instance, they had a whole article there about some of these same things, like how you can prevent the attraction from ever happening. That's the ideal, where the whole idea is to struggle against our desires for the sake of Allah and do what He wants us to do, whether it's with same-sex or heterosexual relationships. Right? That's a challenge that everyone has to face. And to some people to greater extents and some people to lesser extents, we have challenges. Right? And so they kind of put it in that, they framed it like that, and it was very well done. It's a blog that's out there. That might also offer some interesting ways to think about it and also to help other people. In the interest of time, we do need to call this to a close. So if you have questions, email is the best way. You can put your email on a card and write your questions. That way I can respond by email. Because it's hard sometimes to respond to the card questions if it's just a personal issue or something like that, or some idea that doesn't involve everyone else. All right. I want to share one story with you from one of the companions of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, who was there on Karbala. His name is Burayd ibn Khudayr. Sometimes his name is pronounced Khudayr, but it seems like the correct pronunciation is Khudayr. Burayd ibn Khudayr al-Hamdani. So Burayd was a tabi'i. Tabi'i was the second generation of companions. After that first generation, the second generation after the Prophet, so Imam Hussein's generation. And a companion of Ali alayhi salam. He was a devout man and a master of the Quran, someone who was known as Hafid and a reciter, someone who was known as a person who knew the Quran backwards and forwards. He was one of the leaders of Kufa. When he heard that Al-Hussein ibn Ali had refused to pledge his allegiance to Yazid, he immediately abandoned Kufa and fled to Mecca to join with Al-Hussein. Thereafter he accompanied the Imam all the way back to the plain of Karbala. When he advanced to the battlefield, he called out, "I challenge you to come close, O butchers of the faithful. I challenge you to come close, O butchers of the children of the warriors of Badr. I challenge you to come close, O butchers of the progeny of the greatest of God's messengers." A man named Yazid ibn Ma'qil accepted his challenge. He asked him, "O Burayd, what do you think of what God has done to you?" Burayd replied, "He has showered me with blessings and has cursed you." This person, Yazid, said, "You are lying. Before today, I never knew you to be a liar. Do you recall the day when we were walking together in the neighborhood of Bani Lawdhan, when you said, Muawiyah is misguided and the rightly guided Imam is Ali ibn Abi Talib?" Burayd said, "Of course I do, and I declare that that is still my opinion." Yazid said, "And I declare that you are misguided." Burayd challenged him to a mubahala. So they raised their hands to Allah and prayed that He curse the liar and kill him. Then they struck at each other with their swords. Burayd struck his head such that his skull cracked. Yazid sank to the ground with Burayd's sword still stuck in his head. As Burayd tried to pry it free, he was attacked by Radi ibn Munqidh, who grabbed Burayd by the neck. They wrestled on the ground, and Burayd pinned Radi and sat on his chest. Radi called for help. Ka'b ibn Jabir set out to attack Burayd when Zuhayr ibn Ubay yelled out to him, "That is Burayd ibn Khudayr, the reciter of the Quran, the one who used to teach us Quran in the Grand Mosque of Kufa." Ka'b ignored him and stabbed Burayd in the back. Burayd fell forward on top of Radi, at which Radi bit into his face and sunk his teeth into his nose. Ka'b cast Burayd off of Radi's chest with his spear and struck him with a sword and killed him. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdillah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين